But I want to welcome everyone. This is the session that I think most of us have experienced some challenges, many challenges in. And so I was invited by Mike Monty and ACSA to kind of facilitate it. And I immediately thought of several of my colleagues, friends, and associates to help with this discussion. And we purposely designed this session to be a bit informal and maybe more participatory. But before we get into that kind of conversation and informal portion, we do want to identify the guest conveners here. And then I would like our guest conveners to have a short, just kind of discussion about what they observe, what they know, or what they experience in this online and first year realm that we're in. And then we also have included a first year student, who I would like to, many of these discussions we avoid or seem not to have the voice of a student, and which is probably our #1 concern here. And so I wanted to have a student input, and so we've asked one of our first year students to speak to that and maybe show an example of some of the things he's worked on. So with that, I'm Brad Grant. I'm a professor at Howard University in Washington, DC, and I've been tasked, or I'm the coordinator of our first year design program at Howard University. So I've been teaching first year design, certainly in the traditional way for several years, and then this semester shifted over quite quickly, quite suddenly, to first year design studio using the online mode. And so this is dear to me at this point. Professor Crenshaw, could you go next?
So I'm Kristina Crenshaw. I co-teach with Professor Grant at Howard. I am adjunct faculty, so I actually practice full-time and then participate in studio with the first years the rest of the week. So I've been teaching with Brad for the last couple of years together, and then before that, a few years ago, I also taught the first studio sequence at the University of Maryland.
Professor Chance, Dr. Chance.
Hi there. Well, I was a bit embarrassed when Brad asked me to do this because I'm definitely not an expert in teaching remotely, but he asked me here to share international perspectives. Right now, here in Ireland, we're already getting ready for a very different kind of semester to start in September. We're going to have extreme social distancing measures for sure. We'll have as much online delivery as possible, very low concentration of people in the classrooms in most cases, a limit on how many, like a maximum of a day a week that a student could be on the campus. And so we're having to figure out exactly where face-to-face is crucial and how we'll achieve that in various classes. So I'm going to just say my true passion is teaching second year. I haven't done it in a while. I did chair the National Conference on the Beginning Design Student in 2004 at Hampton University, where I taught with Brad for about a decade. And so I'm looking forward to talking with you all more today.
And Professor Margarida Yin.
Oh, okay. My name is Margarida Yin. You can see I'm Chinese descendant, but I grew up in Brazil. That's why I have my first name in Portuguese. Right now, I'm teaching full-time at CalPoly, St. Louis Obispo. It's wonderful weather here to share with all of you. Okay, my experience with the first year design I've been teaching third year quite a bit. So my first year is on and off. So I have to admit, I haven't taught the first year online yet, but I'm teaching right now third year online. So I assume that I do have a lot of common ideas that would apply to all the students on all different levels. but I taught the first year for a long, long time. So in CalPoly, we really try to incorporate the motto of the university, learn by doing, which is very focused on the aspect of the design learning process of design and the design application, and also the design integration. Those are the three very, very important things we try to apply. And by teaching the online courses, design courses, what are the most pressing challenges came up from the transition from the traditional to the online teaching? Based on my reservation and chatting with some of the students, they are hands-on activities, they are missing that. So what can we do in order to also participate in the hands-on activities that the professor talking about design build project? How could that happen? Make it happen. Another one is collaboration, promotes the studio culture, right? The team spirit, learning from each other, right? Connectivity with each other. I mean, that was another one that students expressed the difficulty. And the third one and the last one that we observed is field trips, right? Experiencing architecture, right? It's such an important portion of learning architecture, which site visit and analysis that we as a group sharing and discussing and researching together. That was the three major points that we came up are the major challenges. So I'm here to share, exchange, and brainstorm ideas with all of you and then learn from you at the same time. As Brad puts, right, what we see as important points, right? And or possibilities in the age of online teaching learning. So here I am learning with all of you. And I want to thank you.
And then lastly, we have Ngargmeni, who is our first year student. Theo.
Hello, everybody. My name is Theophile Ngargmeni, and I will be a rising sophomore architecture major at Howard University.
Good. And then I want to recycle around and just do very much what Professor Margarida Yin did, just kind of make some salient points about your observations or experiences in first year design, especially relegated or related to this idea of online teaching. And I put down quickly just 7 points, and I'm going to go through them real quickly, as I found that there was more in the online mode versus the traditional mode. There was more dependence on the teachers delivering the instructions, whereas in the traditional classroom, there's much more learning and teaching that happens between students for the various reasons, you know why. And then one of the things we noticed, Professor Crenshaw and I, and is similar that happened here, is the dead time that happens between or before, right before class starts, right? There's a period where people are kind of gaining entry to the platform, the Zoom platform. And there's this interesting, what I call, what is typically called dead time that actually becomes live time, because Professor Crenshaw and I noticed that our students started to talk about the weather in different parts of the country that they lived in, or talked about current events and so on. It became a lively instruction, so much so that we decided to allow that period before class starts to extend it to allow the students to have this lively discussion. I also found that online instructions, again, for me, required me to be much more prepared. I'm kind of, as you can probably tell, used to winging it quite a bit, and I found that online instructions really required me to be much prepared. The other thing that I noticed is that I really enjoyed the online platform, because those who had their screens, like my screen, where you can see their rooms and to see the backgrounds, I got to have a better feel of where my students live and come from. So there was something that was really nice to see the interior of their environment with this online program that I couldn't do in the studio. So that starts to talk about this holistic education beyond just the technical architectural education. And then Uh, Lastly, I found online teaching was much more exhausting than the traditional. So, Professor Crenshaw, you want to
So
take over there?
yeah, I think a lot of what Professor Grant just went over are things that I wholly agree with, having to gone through them with him. Luckily, I'm much more concerned about being organized and pre-planning than he is. So we kind of managed to balance each other out, where he kept me from over-planning. And I made sure that we at least had some kind of framework to start from in terms of getting things done. One of the things that I found was a challenge is that during the first part of the year, when we were in studio with the students, we were really working towards this idea that each student needed to kind of take some chances, make some decisions on their own, and if they didn't quite know exactly what it was we were looking for, try it, and then let's have a conversation about it where we can kind of work through what you did and kind of what was expected. And that changed a little bit when we went online, in that we took an approach, particularly with them being first year students, that said we need to provide much more specific information on things that they have not done before, so that in some ways they weren't feeling lost at home, where they didn't have access to other students or professors or somebody else that they could bounce questions off in terms of troubleshooting things in order to keep them moving forward. And that kind of ties into my other thought, is that to me, a large part of first year design teaching is building a certain level of confidence within each of these students and their abilities to actually make it through the program and do the work that we're asking them to do. And part of that comes from having you kind of standing next to them and looking at what they're doing and saying, yes, that's right, or, well, not quite that, but this is how we get there. And not being able to do that as easily in an online setting was something that I found probably not just challenging for the students, but challenging for me as well, because it's hard in some ways to balance the need for constructive criticism to help push forward with this need for positive reinforcement to keep people from losing kind of their enthusiasm and their confidence in what they're doing. And the last thing that really kind of stuck out to me was this question about how we were going about teaching first year studio altogether. So at Howard, a lot of what we focus on in the first year is just kind of graphic communications and basic standards. So a lot of these students come in and they don't know what a plan is, what a section is, what an elevation. Well, this is what all those are. This is how you develop a plan. This is how you draw it. And a lot of what we do is actually still manual for the first year. Everything's done by hand. You draw by hand, you model by hand, you got to know how to use line weights and all of that kind of basic stuff. So I came through school at a point where things are changing. My entire undergrad was done by hand, but my entire grad school education was done on the computer. So I see the benefits in kind of both approaches. And I'm kind of all on board with this idea that first year should still kind of be done by hand, get that kind of hand to brain connection in terms of understanding what you're doing before the computer becomes an easy out for you. But what I found was that when we got online, that actually became a hindrance to us being able to quickly transition what we were doing for the students. And a lot of them didn't have access to scanners or other things that would allow them to get hand-drawn or hand-produced documents and models into a digital format so that we could then actually critique it and discuss it and present it. And that raises the question to me on if maybe the idea that we should stick to hand-generated things in the first year still makes sense in today's day and age, or if we should start introducing technology earlier in the process. But then how do you do that without kind of presenting a situation where the students start to see technology as a crutch, as opposed to viewing it as the tool it should be to help you do the work that you are trying to do as an architect?
Great.
Very good.
Shannon, can you continue?
Sure, I can share some of my observations, I guess. So just last week, I was speaking with my own second year studio professor from Virginia Tech, long time ago, Ron Daniel, and he's actually teaching first year studio now as a kind of emeritus adjunct. And he said he was able to make a fairly smooth transition online, but you know, he had established a lot of the groundwork working with the students since the fall. And he's also going to teach Virginia Tech's Accelerated Summer Studio, I understand. So I was really wondering, I was really curious about this. Like, this is a boot camp that helps move students along so that they complete an entire first year in the summertime. And if they have to do this all entirely online, that could be a real challenge. And I started to think about how I couldn't even fathom taking such a course online, and how important the social connections were that the students built who did go through that. I didn't take that program, but their social connections were even stronger than my group. And I remember all of these things about first year that we won't have if we're doing this entirely online. So, you know, our experience in the fall could be quite a bit different than what we had this past spring. The students won't be able to follow along as easily. They won't have all the stuff around for inspiration from the upper year students. They won't even have the upper year students walking past, commenting and starting up conversations with them. They won't even be able to see the kind of tools that architects use, because they won't just be lying around for them to ask or to wander into the various shops. So how will we be able to create that kind of environment? And we may have to kind of flip things around. People are saying in the chat box how important the tactile nature is, but we may have to start with digital models, or much more even controlled kind of things, because, you know, in first year, when I didn't know what was going on, I could look at a couple of different examples and kind of, you know, different ideas people had, and kind of build off of that, grow off of that, or take it in a different direction, but I still have inspiration. But this isn't going to be so different from another thing I'm working on. Right now I have kind of a joint appointment. I teach first year engineering and actually graduate engineering at TU Dublin, and a bit of architecture technology. But the other half of my job is doing engineering education research and curriculum design for University College London, or with them. And so I'm on a team of people at University College London that's designing a new architectural engineering curriculum for a new university in Cairo. And this program is going to be accredited by the Royal Institute of British Architects, we plan. And I'm designing the first module. It's Introduction to Architecture, Environment, and Construction. And building in this kind of designing for students who are going to come in and be the first in their entire university to do architecture will have those same challenges. We'll be able to provide them with some tools, but the examples won't be as readily available. So these are all things that I'm trying to wrap my head around here. I could wrap it up there, Brad, and talk about more if other things come up.
Great. Margarida, did you have anything? You kind of gave us some pointers of your experience. Did you have anything to add? Or should we move to Theo? Theo, am I mute?
No, we hear
Oh my
you,
God.
Brad.
Oh. Theo, I invited Theo to present a first year student's point of view and maybe point out some of his experiences. And then I would like him, if you folks can bear with us, I want him to share just briefly a project that he worked on as we embarked on this online format.
Yes, so as a first year student coming into architecture at Howard University, I quickly understood that it was a very tedious subject, whether it was making the plans by hand, because we did start off doing all the drawings by hand. I found out that not only the drawings, the plans, the sections, the elevations, the axons, but also the making of the models were very, very tedious undertakings. And moving from the classroom to online, something that really was racing through my mind was how all of that was really going to fit on this online platform. Because just as while we were still in the environment with other students, just as Professor Crenshaw, Professor Grant mentioned, we had all our peers around us to look for inspiration or ask questions, get different perspectives. We had other professors to ask questions to, and we had other upperclassmen from second, third, fourth, fifth year to draw inspiration. So moving to the online platform, it was obvious that all these different assets were going to be somehow lost to us. But fortunately, our professors did, as Professor Crenshaw said, they tried to figure out ways to make it more not only easy, but possible to actually do everything we needed to do. And part of that was breaking up the projects into stages. So instead of telling us what the end goal is and telling us to figure everything out on our own, every class period, we had a different part of the process to complete. For example, if we had to, by the end, have a section, an elevation, a plan, axon, models, every week, every class period, we had to first do the section. Next, you can do the elevation. Next, you can do the axon, and so forth. So having that iterative process definitely helped a lot with just undertaking all the different projects and concepts we had to do. And that made the tedious aspect a little more possible to do, especially because a lot of us are also taking other classes on top of architecture. So having that was very, very helpful to us. Another thing that was really lost coming from the studio environment to online learning was the aspect of physical touch. When we made models, for example, we could physically hold them and maneuver them in such a way to explain exactly what we were thinking when we were building them. And that was something that was going to be lost as well. And it's a very important asset because it helps to get ideas across a lot more easily and in a more streamlined manner. So we had to default to taking pictures and trying to get as many angles as we could. But that simply just, it doesn't replace it. But we simply did what we had to do. So moving from the classroom to the online platform, there was a change that had to happen, but I think it was also a necessary change because something that I also learned from architecture is that as we advance in the process, we're going to have to adapt to changes. And I understand that it is not only from my perspective as a first year student, but for all of you as well, professional, whether you're teachers or practitioners, we all have this shift that we have to kind of understand and be able to adapt to. So all of the experience that I've amassed is only going to have to be able to be moldable, be able to change, be subject to change, because after all, we can't change the environment. So we have to adapt to it, as well as shape it the way that we see fit for it to work toward our benefit. So with that being said, Professor Grant wanted me to share a bit of the most recent project we took, and I'll be sharing my screen to show just part of it. And so this project was a shelter design. We students had the choice of either making bus shelters or pavilions or different benches, seating in different areas that we chose. So just as I said, each week or each class period, we were tasked with making one portion. So one week was, for example, to build a site model with an analysis, for example. So this is an example of the site plan analysis that I took, for example. Sometimes we were asked to make just like a floor plan like this, as you see, with different dimensions. So here's an example of that from my project. I decided to make a bus shelter. So yeah, so you get an idea of just the iterative process. Each class period, we were tasked with making the next step in our design. And as we were doing so, we had the feedback from not only our peers, but our teachers as well, to just understand if what we were doing was making sense, or if it wasn't making sense, how to improve upon it. as well as to just get different perspectives and ideas from all of the different people that we had with us. So here you see just my personal process with it. This was one of my final models, and here's a representation of how I wanted these dividers to be, because this particular project also had the idea of social distancing in mind. And my remedy to that was to make panels that could come inside and outside of the actual structure when we needed it to. So here you just get a sense of the different types of drawings we had to do. I drew all of these by hand, and I used Photoshop afterward to kind of help enhance the visibility so that you could understand and get a better idea of, I guess, the thought process behind everything. So yeah, so this is just an overlook of the undertakings we had.
So I think to talk a little bit more about that project, just so you kind of understand where the whole thing came from. The final project of the second semester and first year, we really try to focus on the idea of design as an iterative process. And the way we approach that with this particular project is that we actually ask the students to start with a site. They know what their end goal in terms of the structure they're going to design is going to be, but then they're given an actual chair that pre-exists, and they're asked to transform that chair from its initial form into the structure that it needs to be in the end. And what was great about us being involved in that particular project is that it made it easy for us to kind of break it up into individual steps that we could assign to the students on a class-by-class basis. It made sense to control the flow of information and the process. And so it worked for this first year class. I don't know how easy it is to do that same kind of adjustment when you're talking about a larger, more involved design process. We also had the benefit this time of, we had just prior to being locked in for social distancing, beginning to introduce the students to the basics of Photoshop and InDesign and how to use those tools for presentation of their work, still expecting them to do all the hand drawings and hand modeling that we asked them to do. So we were lucky in the regards that that made it a little bit easier for our first years to transfer into an online environment. But if this had happened, I think first semester, the outcome would have been something completely different. And so that's where the question lies, right? Where we all had the benefit of the first 5 or 6 months of in-studio education to set the foundation that held us up as we moved into the last 5 weeks of our semester. But that's going to be much, much harder to do when you're starting from scratch with these students. Did we lose Professor Grant?
Yeah, we've lost one. Somebody just came back in. 2 just came back in. Brad, are you there?
So taking over for Brad until he manages to come back in, I think, you know, part of his intention for this is, after we've kind of talked about and identified some of the things that we've all kind of picked up in this concept of switching from in studio to online teaching of first year design, what are some like overall thoughts? We want to hear from the rest of you guys in terms of how we can start to address some of these particular issues. Are there additional ones that we should be considering? Or do you have specific thoughts on the ones that have already been brought up?
But does anybody want to jump in?
I'm sorry.
I would say one of the things that I'm seeing really advantageous, even being online with all you people, and I know my daughter is teaching a dance class to 6 and 8-year-olds that had to shift to online. So she's instructing from her living room, which is not really optimal, and they're all in their living rooms too. But one of the things that I'm noticing with her, and she's dealing with small kids, and first year is just a little bit older, this gives you an opportunity to get names. And one of the things that's always very difficult when you're approaching a first year class, and I don't as much teach studio as I teach lecture courses, is knowing people's names. And one of the things that's great on the screen is you can call someone by name. And I think just as a starting point, it's a great way to learn their names, for them to learn each other's names. And just calling someone by name, I think, can really make it feel closer. It's just a very small thing, but I think it's an important part of this Zoom thing that works really well. And I was also saying that if on the chat, if you can't scan something, everyone's got cell phones. Just take a crappy cell phone picture and post it. Because, you know, when you're looking at sort of drawing and quick and dirty work, you don't want to have somebody fuss over a scanner when you can just take a cell phone shot and that'll work. It's good enough.
So, hi, this is Samia from Morgan State University, and I'll just jump in to add something that we do regardless of the social distancing. In the first year, when our students, incoming freshmen, come in, we actually kind of engage them in the process of at least 2 of the 6 learning objectives. We ask them what would they like to learn. So I think more than ever, that kind of strategy might come in very handy now, where we can actually solicit information. What tools do you have at home? What materials do you have access to? And then not really go in as we usually do with 100% crafted course syllabus. Leave some room for students' input to develop a course in conjunction with the student. Sharing the 4 learning objectives and then asking them, what would you like to, what are your aspirations? What do you have access to? And I totally agree with you, Terry, that this has been really a remarkable thing for me to be able to, and I teach about 75 students a semester. And I've always struggled with, I want to call everyone out by their names, but I have very limited memory memory width. So this is really nice because I can actually see the names of the students, and I have become much more connected and plus we are all in each other's homes. So that relationship, it's like they're in my house and I'm in their house. So that kind of camaraderie that I have developed in the last 7 weeks has been amazing. And I think that we need to kind of engage the students in allowing them to shape the course and the assignments.
So I want to jump in on that, and then a couple of the comments that are popping up in the chat. That's one thing that we did do with this particular project, is that each student picked their own site based on a space that they actually knew and could go to and understood. And that was a way to kind of give them some ownership, but also to make sure that they were able to accurately respond to the site because it was something that they knew. Last year when we did this project, we actually specified that everybody had to design the same type of instructure. And this time we opened it up to a little bit more variety. We said what structure works best depending on the site that you guys are actually choosing to work with. And so I think that was another thing. We knew what the end goal of the project was, but we really kind of had to take it on a day-by-day basis. Okay, how did they handle this day's assignment? Are they making accurate progress? Where do we need to put more effort into kind of addressing things with the students in order to work with this online situation kind of the best way possible? One of the chat comments, or a couple of them, are really talking about this idea about sociability. And so one of the things that we did with our students is we actually ended up breaking them into sections after we moved to online teaching. Professor Grant and I had 27 students, and for the last 6 months, we basically just tackled the entire class as a team. and any student could talk to either one of us at any point. But we ended up breaking them up when we went online, and part of that was so that we could then break into smaller groups with each online class session. And he had half the class and I had half the class, and that allowed for some more one-on-one interaction. It allowed for direct one-on-one feedback with each student as we talked about their progress. But we also tried to encourage conversation between the students in those individual breakout sessions so that they could still kind of get some of that class feedback from their classmates. And we also added some time in there just for like basic check-in, talk about things that weren't even studio project related, as a way to kind of hopefully maintain and continue to build some of the relationships and camaraderie that they were already starting to establish during the first part of the school year.
Brad, it's Ron Kloster down the road at Hampton. Nice to see you.
Hey, Ron.
Hey,
How you doing?
doing well.
What's
all
happening
things
at
considered.
what's happening at Hampton's first year's? What's happening at Hampton's first year online studio?
About the same thing that's happening with you online. And I'm going to run myself crazy over the summer trying to figure out how to start with a new group with no background, which, as has been alluded to, we at least had the benefit of having had them for a semester. I was going to say that the first thing we do with them at Hampton, which will easily work just as well online, is we have them do a self-portrait and introduce themselves to everybody since they're from far corners of the country. And that seems like a great way to start it out online as well as in person. It works really well to try to get everybody together. We have about the same number as you do. We had 27 this year as well, so.
I have a question. Before I ask it, if you could mute your microphones if you're not talking. I get a lot of feedback, and I'm not used to Jimi Hendrix in my ear at these Zoom meetings. Mark Blizzard, I teach at UTSA in San Antonio, and I teach throughout our program. Currently, I'm not teaching in the first year, but I found that different virtual pinup boards, and I was just took a trip up to Kent State. I zoomed up there for a review of second year interior design students. And they were using Miro, but Concept Board is another one where you can have this virtual pinup space where students come in as editors, and over the course of a project, they accumulate product. And every time one of the students is in the space, their cursor can be seen on everyone's proscenium there. And so it encourages this kind of back and forth engagement. I know it's not like you're in an actual design studio, but you can collaborate, and there's all sorts of things that I've begun to introduce into my own way of thinking as we go forward into the summer and into the fall. And it's great to see you, Shannon.
Thanks, Mark. Likewise. Yeah, I see a lot of people I know in here. Carmina, Andrew, Shelley, Jory. So, and of course, Ron, who taught me how to teach. Brad did a little of that too. But Ron and I used to teach second year together. Yeah. I told them at the beginning, I don't know if you were here, but I said second year was my true passion. So
I was, yeah. I'm taking notes. I've got to check out a number of these things. We use Blackboard Collaborate at Hampton, which works fairly well. I'm going to experiment with Zoom this fall as well. Most of my students ended up using Genius Scan, which, you know, scans just by taking photos with its app for a smartphone. They do that, and they put together a PDF out of that, put it in a share file, and it works fairly nicely. As soon as they learn to be concerned about formatting things, it's always tough to get them to format well. but I want to check out Concept Board and Miro.
Hi, this is Carol Herman. I'm from Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, and we had 60 first-year students. And we just finished up reviews at all levels. And I think one of the things that happened, our students came in without, the feedback is really a lot. Our students come in without a portfolio, and we don't teach them digital skills until the end of first year, and we don't expect them to use them in studio till second year. So it was a lot. But because they come without a portfolio, they had a wide range of skills coming into our program. And one of the things we found is that the way they were able to hack the tools when they're working alone, sorry, let me turn my picture on. When they're working alone or working in small groups in the Zoom rooms, the first year students had an incredible array of ways to do things that no one would have ever imagined that they could do. And just having gone to second year reviews, they were appreciably more tentative and scared and traditional in the way that they did things. The fourth and fifth year students, they're digital, it's all easy. But the first year students, and this went way crazy in some really, really good ways. And the second year students were actually jealous of them.
Can you give us examples of how way crazy they went? In what ways?
Well, they used Rhino and hand drawing and Revit, and some of them learned SketchUp in a day, and some of them learned Revit in a week, and they planted their models out in the garden. Their parents were making them dig, and they used cereal boxes, and they used sort of large, heavy objects that they found in their homes to make things. They just like they hacked it together in every conceivable way. It was really kind of amazing. They made websites, and they scanned hand drawings and everything in between. It was kind of exciting.
It was interesting. And I think that's the thing with first year, is that they're not so set in their ways, or you haven't drummed into them a certain way of doing things, so that by the time that we got to online learning, we basically were like, listen, you know what our expectations are in terms of the quality of what we're asking you to produce. Do whatever you need to do to make that happen in some ways. And some students obviously are more successful at that than others. But I think it points to this kind of truth in some ways, that in order to do first year learning online from the beginning, in some ways you have to let go of all the things you've come to expect, or all the ways you thought first year education kind of should go and should do, and what they should be producing, in order to redevelop a curriculum that maybe is more conducive to whatever their current situation is supposed to be. I think Professor Grant and I were briefly discussing, what are we going to do if we have to go into the fall with a fresh crop of students with no experience, and teach them all the things that we taught the students in studio previously. And I think our initial thoughts was that we're not necessarily going to change what we do, but change maybe how we do it. And so that may mean that we have to dedicate some time to doing videos of all of the in-person kind of demonstrations that we normally would have done by pinning up a piece of paper in the studio and working on that in front of the students. So that in the end, we're not necessarily changing what we're doing, we're still giving them the same foundation that we've been able to give the students moving forward, but adjusting our approach in a way that we feel would be more beneficial. You know, and similarly speaking, I think that instead of kind of taking this whole address the whole class together situation, that we may have to, from the get-go, go with smaller groups with the students next semester or next year if we're online, just so that we can give them all a little bit more of that one-on-one time and attention and feedback and help. That's a little bit easier to do in person than it is to do online, but it's still very necessary, I think, for their overall kind of benefit as they go through the process.
Well said, Kristina, well said. I mean, I'm teaching a furniture design and construction class this semester. And when we were told that I have a cat that's attacking me right now because I haven't fed her and she turns into a vicious creature, I apologize. But I was concerned. I was very concerned. I mean, how do you teach a class that you're supposed to be like studio? You're supposed to be a lot of hands-on. You're in there with the shop equipment. And so I called my younger brother, who has, I don't know, 20 years teaching online experience, and he's acknowledged as a major expert in online delivery, design, and evaluation and management of science courses and science curriculum. He teaches currently at Ashford as a course lead. And he said, Mark, you have to get it into your head. This is a different class. It's a different class. Sure, the content is the same, just as you were saying, Kristina, but it's a very different class. I think that the interesting part, however, of my own studios, and I was taught at Virginia Tech back in the old days. And I think what stayed behind are all the little incidental things. The fact that my professor, Ron Daniel, would be bringing around some little object or a Graphies magazine or a book, or make some offhand comments about, graphic design or something. And then they stay in my mind, and somehow within the Zoom format, by the way, Zoom is much better than Blackboard because you have the gallery. You can actually see your students. But what stuck in my mind is how do you take that sort of free form engagement, which is very spontaneous, which I think is critical to any studio, and how do you bring it into this, this proscenium? And so I've orchestrated an opening. Every one of my studios has an opening. As the students filter in, we listen to jazz, of course, but once class starts, I put something on the table, some sort of discovery that I've made, something that makes a connection, perhaps vicariously to their work, perhaps a little discovery which could lead to a conversation. Sometimes an object, right? There's nothing like a Philippe Starck juicer to get people talking. And so I've kind of had to orchestrate the sort of the spontaneous, if maybe that's a good way to put it, to orchestrate the spontaneous. And that's the beginning of every class. And at the end of the class, I also gather everyone together out of their groups. And there's something that came up during the class, which then I share to everyone.
Mark, I like this idea of orchestrating the spontaneous. And again, that's what I was alluding to earlier in my comments. We have students, in our case, from all over the country and some outside the country, I guess mostly the Caribbean and perhaps Africa. But it automatically, I recall Professor Crenshaw, we had a student from New Orleans who, because our studio time was around his lunch time, the time zone, he would often come to the Zoom class with some really delightful and delicious food that he had prepared or his family had prepared. And that kind of instigated this spontaneous conversations about food and regional foods. We had students in Minnesota, students in New Orleans, students in Trinidad, students in Pasadena. And because of this kind of food, spontaneous delight started these conversations, perhaps centered around food, again, perhaps centered around significant current events that became very powerful nature of connecting students. And I think someone talked about this idea of being in their homes. I really enjoyed seeing their home, their environment. There was a couple of times to move around their apartment or their homes to get to something or retrieve something. As they were walking through their house, we could see the design and the interiors of their house, which really connected better, again, much better than knowing them in the studio. But Theo, I see you smiling. I want to see what kind of challenges or what kind of input from a student did you see some of these things that
I'm mainly smiling because as you speak about the different experiences we personally had in our classroom, it just brings back all the different memories, and I'm getting to just understand kind of your process. Because as a student, we don't see what the teachers are planning. We only see the results of it when we come to class. So I guess it's just interesting to see that from your perspective as well. You were also kind of enjoying this aspect of seeing where everybody is, getting this different nature of who your students are, and it just made me realize that it's the same way with students toward the teachers. It's like, wow, so this is where they live, or this is how they live, this is how they interact with their environment. And I read a comment just now that said yes, because having that spontaneous nature also helps the students bring something to the table. And I think that's very much an important part of the online learning, because it really does bring a lot to the table when the students themselves have the ability to say whatever they want to say, not necessarily being restricted, because it's still a classroom after all, and we have to be formal, and we have to be this and that. So having almost a loose yet controlled nature in the classroom, especially in an online setting, helps to improve the learning as well.
One has to be careful. There's a caveat. I have a lot of students who come from incredibly impoverished backgrounds, and at least Teams offers a way to blur the background. Zoom, you can put an architectural model like John has, this wonderful urban model behind his face, and of course it makes him look really good, doesn't it? Just a joke. But I think we have to be careful. We have to be very sensitive to the fact that I have students with 2 children, with no domestic partner, working at least one job, trying to go to school full time. I have people that they're embarrassed about showing their background. And I think we have to give them options. We have to not put a lot of pressure on them to turn on their cameras. I did that initially. I wanted to make sure they were there. That has to do with this masculine desire to control, I'm afraid. But I pulled back from that and said, that's not the way to teach these people, right? I mean, you have to allow them to come to you. I love the comment earlier about the first day of class and having the students essentially paint their own portrait and bring their own visage the way they want to this Wunderkammer, because that's what this is, a Wunderkammer, isn't it?
No, sorry.
Can I jump in? Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, yeah, because I think for me, it's a kind of a good moment to kind of voice my kind of greatest concerns when we're kind of talking about the domestic space that our students will likely be operating in this fall. I mean, I think there's a broad range of assumptions. My name is Rick Ngargmeni. I teach at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And I've been running first-year studios for about 30 years now, in various kind of forms and with a variety of different collaborators. And we still do in our first term have the students work manually. It's we consider it still a high priority, as I believe most of you do. We do transition fairly quickly into certain digital techniques towards the end of the first term, and then gradually move them into Rhino in their second term of first year. And by the end of that, they're reasonably competent, and we had a very smooth landing at the end of this past year because of just how quickly they had adapted to these new digital technologies. And we have to remember that we're dealing with an entirely different generation of students here. Right? These are students who are fully immersed in digital technologies from birth, and we have to give them a lot of credit, I think, in terms of their ability to understand and adapt to these technologies much quicker than we can. Me, at least, in particular. But nonetheless, as people have said earlier, as we kind of said earlier, it is a different way of teaching. We can't do things the way we typically can. Because they are first-year students, they have no experience with a studio environment. They have no understanding of what it actually kind of takes, the commitment involved, which, and has been mentioned by others here earlier too, from learning from their peers, both their classmates and the upper year kind of students as well, who provide models for them in terms of ways of behaving, ways of working. And it's hard enough to get a first-year student to learn how to work. I mean, it's chaos at the beginning of any very kind of first year, and you just kind of accept the fact that there's a level of maturity, right, that they generally will grow into fairly kind of quickly. In our particular case, you may have other studio cultures in your schools. At our school, because we're in a small town, everybody works in studio. Otherwise, they're kind of living in various residential situations in this sort of small town where we are in Cambridge, Ontario. And so there's no kind of commuter culture. Nobody works at home with mom and dad. It's very, very rare that that happens at our school up until now. And it works really, really well for us because students are always there in first year working with each other, and they drive each other forward, and they keep, you know, it keeps them kind of working consistently. But it's very, very different in a domestic environment, as has been pointed out, where you have siblings around, parents, dogs, you know, pets of various kind of kinds, and a lot of kind of distraction. And you're with a milieu of people who don't understand the commitment that it takes to be an architecture student. And so the students aren't picking that up from the environment that's around them. And the only way they're going to get it is whatever they kind of see on screen, which is very, very limited. Because as soon as we step out, which is, I know, and we've all been in this situation for quite some time now, it's a weird thing to feel like right now we're all in a room together, and then in one moment with a flash, we're in a completely kind of different space, right? We're back in our kind of homes. And once they're back in their kind of homes, what's going to kind of compel them and drive them to continue to develop as students operating in what we normally kind of expect to be a productive studio environment. Well, I don't know how to get past that. I don't know whether I can assume that I can order drafting boards and have my students kind of draft at home. I have no idea whether they have enough space, depending on where they're living, to be able to kind of do that, to have the kind of privacy or just simply the luxury of kind of that much room they have to set up on the kitchen table after dinner and then start to work. Then I have no idea. And I don't know whether anybody has any other feelings kind of around that, or any ways of dealing with it. My sense right now is that we may just completely abandon the idea of any kind of any manual work altogether and start straight into kind of digital work, because at least
don't abandon the sketchbook. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm done. Sorry.
Don't abandon the sketchbook, by the way. Please don't.
You wouldn't abandon the sketchbook.
Oh no, because you can do so much. I mean, you don't need a triangle and a parallel bar. You don't need a draft. You don't need that. But the sketchbook.
Yeah, this is a discussion I think we need to have. I mean, it's one I'm interested in having.
So one of the things that we do with our first year studio is that every Friday, particularly in the first semester, we do a field trip somewhere. Mm-hmm. And the students are required to sketch on site as part of that. And I think that's something that's easily adaptable to this kind of online situation. They can still go out and sketch and then discuss their sketches as part of that process. Moving in a second semester, we don't do as many field trips. What we do is have the students read Invisible Cities. And then we assign over the course of the semester, they have to take 4 of those cities and actually draw what they interpret the descriptions to be describing to them. And so I think that's one way that you can kind of keep this idea of sketching and manual work, even if in terms of the actual lessons you're doing, you're starting to move to something a little more heavily digitally focused, just based on what you're trying to accomplish. Another thing that we do a lot in first year is we actually assign a lot of group work to the students. And part of that is because we want them to get used to this idea of having to figure out how to deal with people who don't work and think and function the same way that they do.
Yeah.
And a lot of those projects are actually broken up into, there's a combined group analysis portion where they do their initial research on the site and the background and the history, and then they're each tasked with developing their own individual designs for that. But I think that maybe a focus on a little bit more group work in this online environment might actually help with some of the kind of team building and socialization questions that are being asked about how you still encourage that when everybody is in a completely different location and not in the same room.
Brad, can I ask a question about, am I on?
Yes.
A lot of the discussion in many of the chats, I'm sorry, Andrew Chin, Florida A&M University. A lot of the discussion in many of the kind of faculty discussions about the shock of this new is often tied to trying to find, and even I've trying to find ways to replicate what I know, how I was taught, and how I can still do what I want to do. But I'm also curious, isn't this also an opportunity to undo the things that we know should not be repeated? How is this an opportunity to let go of some of the things that aren't that great about studio? Most of us probably noticed that with the change of this coming semester, it was a whole lot easier to get professional jurors to jump in to your end of the semester review because they didn't have to travel and lose a day of work. It was a lot easier to get alumni to come in from every shade, color, and gender from all points of the country to come in and participate in reviews. And I've also noticed that in a lot of the most shy student with their, and it goes to someone's point about allowing them to turn their screen off, letting them have control of kind of the situation, because some students don't want the screen on. Versus I'm watching some faculty tell them, you must turn your screen on. I want to see you. But kind of letting go of some of the control, the power, and should they be up 20 hours a week, 20 hours a day, hacking away at some project. And actually, sometimes we lament they need to be out in the world. Well, guess what? They're not stuck in the building anymore. What are the good things? Because a lot of them will say they're tired of sitting in the studio for 3 to 4 hours waiting to get a 15-minute crit, that they actually like the Zoom conversation. And a lot of them are more comfortable. This is a TikTok generation. They like the video communication a lot more than the face-to-face. So my question is, how can we even make some things better and let go of some of the problems?
Yeah. Do you agree with that? Did you enjoy online more than the in-face conversations? And I actually want to ask about getting out of the studio, right? Because we went on field trips every Friday. And what I remember is a lot of grumbling about, oh, I have to figure out how to get to where we're going. And do we really have to do this? But was that really just the, I didn't want to pay for the Metro situation, or that you guys didn't enjoy, you know, the opportunity to get out of the studio? I think this is a good area where maybe you can be specific about a student's perspective.
Yeah, so for the second part about going to different field trips, I know that speaking, I guess, for most of the students, I don't believe it was that it was a Metro thing, and at the same time, I don't believe that a lot of us really didn't enjoy the work. It was more of a natural response to having a responsibility. As students, whenever you have something else to do, that's just another thing. That's just another thing your professors give you to do, and you have a million other classes to do. So that, I think that the responses that you saw with people grumbling or not being happy were mostly because of that. But when it actually came down to the work we were doing, I believe that not only was it necessary, but at the end of the day, we all grew kind of an appreciation for it, because this is our I guess our area of expertise that we're chasing after. We're world aspiring architects, so the actual work itself wasn't the issue. As for I think what was, can you repeat the first part of your statement again?
Did you find that the online interaction was better, worse, the same as kind of the in-person?
Wow. That's a very interesting question because I don't know, just as the previous spokesperson said, they both have different, I guess, advantages and disadvantages. So in terms of personally which one I preferred, I must say that I preferred the studio because there is just no replacement for that physical nature of things, having, you know, different perspectives right at your fingertip, or you know, being able to interact with everybody around you. I don't think there's a proper, I guess, way to replace that. But I did also understand that moving into the online format, some advantages, just as the other, I think it was Mr. Andrew, I can't remember. But yeah, it is easier to incorporate more perspectives because you don't have to worry about traveling. So if you have access to a device that has Zoom or whatever platform you're using to communicate, it's a lot easier to get more people involved, to get more of the perspectives that you're looking for with an actual project. So I think that's kind of how I kind of interpret everything. So between the two, I think I would still lean toward studio because it just has a lot more to offer. But I do understand that there are, I guess, benefits and differences between the two.
So I actually want to stay on you for 1 second, Theo, because I think one of the other things that we were really struggling with, not so much in that it needed to happen and that there were greater opportunities to have more people participate, was but how to effectively conduct a review of the final project over Zoom, as opposed to being in the studio session. So Theo, I don't know if you want to talk about kind of your thoughts about the final review process and how that went and what you thought about it.
Yeah, so for the actual reviews that we had throughout the end of the semester there, I think in terms of how they went, I wouldn't say they were very different from having in-person reviews, in that the formats are pretty much similar, where you have a board or some visual representation and you stand in front of it and you present kind of your thought process behind everything. You point toward, you know, the different drawings you did, or you know, you can do that same thing. And the way that we did it using PowerPoint or Google Slides or PDFs was very, very similar. So we had, you know, all the representations there, and we could scroll down, scroll up, and present them in a very similar manner. So I think the difference between the two just lies with the actual physical nature of it. So in terms of presentation, I wouldn't say there was too much of a difference. But yeah, I guess that's just my, I guess, thought process behind it.
Ron, can you turn your mic on?
There we go.
Yeah, you're
I had it on, then I turned
muted,
it off.
Ron.
Now I'm back. We had problems. That final review with 27 people, one of the advantages of doing it in person is that you can do 6 groups of students present their work and be reviewed at the same time, because you can see their work all at the same time. You get 6 groups, you get half an hour each for a 3-hour final review. 27, you get what, 5 or 6 minutes each. And it gets, you know, really kind of hectic and a little bit, there's a lot of good comments, but a little less in depth because of, you know, jumping one-to-one. Is there software out there or whatever that could help facilitate that? I'm not sure. Or any other thoughts, I would welcome them.
You know, when I went up to Kent State, my colleague Bill Willoughby sent me a Miro link. So I showed up the night before as a guest, as a viewer only. I did not have editing capabilities. And I sort of watched the student cursors. There must have been about 10 o'clock at night, the night before a review. There they were in the studio adding new drawings to their timelines. And so what I thought was very interesting is I could actually go in and look at the work, right? And not just that, but during the presentation, I could have it, because I operate with several screens. I don't know whether, I've got 3 cameras, 3 different screens. I mean, one's a very small little screen. But this works very well, by the way, because I can hook this up to Zoom and carry it around with me into my own shot. But I was able to actually see them working and see their work ahead of time, and then also to have it up in front of me, that after they provide, and I think Theo talked about the narrative of the presentation quite nicely. The difference is that you only see one part at a time, whereas when you're at an actual review, you grasp the whole. I think it's the difference between looking at a roadmap and looking at your GPS. These are 2 very different things. They're not really that similar, I would argue. However, with the Miro and seeing the students' complete presentation in Miro and having followed their narrative, which is in many cases were very well articulated and crafted, unlike standing in front of a board pointing at 50 different things. It was actually crafted in a very understandable way. But I was also able to see the whole presentation on another screen.
Yeah, I sat on a couple of reviews, not for our studio, but other studios where they kind of still did the kind of traditional board where everything was on one large sheet and tried to present it over Zoom. And I found it incredibly hard to follow as a reviewer. And so as part of that, in our particular studio, we actually asked them to do a slide presentation so they can kind of focus on exactly what they needed to talk about with each slide. And part of that, particularly as first-year students, was that we were hoping that it would help them craft their narrative, because you have to craft what you're saying to go along with each slide that you're about to pull up. And so there's this kind of natural force that makes you put it in a logical order. And then we, Professor Grant and I actually ended up breaking our studio for the final review into 3 sections, even though there is only 2 of us. And that was to allow us to give each student more time to present and receive feedback. And part of making that happen was actually relying on our co-professors who taught other years to help manage the rooms that we could not be in. And there was a lot of planning, I think, that went into us kind of setting up who went into what group and who we wanted to make sure we saw and who we thought could present without the benefit of us being there. And it was a highly choreographed thing where I was in one room and he was in another, and then we moved to another room and I moved him to another. So it was a lot of pre-planning, but I think it was worth it in the long run in order to give each of the students the additional time they needed to present and defend their projects, but also receive the feedback that the guest reviewers were there to give them.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I was thinking about as we were coming out of it, whether we do it simultaneously, as you've mentioned, or if we figure out a different way to manage time and do 2 sections over 2 days. But then you're in competition with the other studios. It starts to eat up a lot of time. But I think we're going to have to look at how we manage time, not just in the studio, but within the program, and we look at these things like that.
May I share a screen? Is that okay? I don't want to interrupt someone else. This is Kent State, 2nd year. This is their Miro pinup board. And the studio is taught by William Willoughby, who's the associate dean over there for something or other, right? So you have each of these are the individual students, and you can zoom in on their work if you want to see it, and you can actually see them work on it in real time, so you can see things that they've added. The resolution is fantastic. It takes a minute because I just opened the site. On the right, you see a map of the whole. Over here, you see a map of the entire pinup space. And you can actually scroll through this yourself as the student is talking. And I don't know, maybe I'm just a slow learner, but I thought this was absolutely fantastic. And I couldn't wait even to incorporate it into the traditional studio. I think would be very good. We have a downtown campus in San Antonio, and I know some students commute from 45 minutes away. So this is perhaps a way to augment a studio and to be able to share at least some level, as Andrew was saying earlier, of studio interaction without, without having to drive after dinner back downtown to San Antonio.
Mark, I even think what's even better is starting to recognize that what tools were we forced into over the last 4 months that we should not let go of. I mean, I was shocked when I heard one professor at the end of the semester says, oh no, I'm not going to be able to review all my students, and I'm going to chop their time down. And I asked him, is the review, I said to them, isn't the review primarily for the students to practice their oral presentation skills and to get feedback from the guests? And he said, yeah. And I said, so why do you have to be there when everyone presents? So I know what they said. I said, can't you watch a recording? Because my feeling was, why can't you run 4 reviews, break them into multiple groups, have 2 to 3 guests in each group, because we all have a billion alumni out there, and run all the reviews in 4 different rooms at the same time. And the only reason this person, I feel, felt like it had to be everyone at one time in one space is because that's the physical practice that has been going on for him for the last 20 years, that all 18 students need to be in the room with the 4 guests. And I said, no, you can easily get a bunch of alumni and have 4 concurrent reviews, and instead everyone gets 30 minutes, not 5 minutes. And then you watch the recording, because your grade isn't based on the jury. Your grade is based on what they produce and what they did all semester long. So I think there's some things, as Mark pointed out, I think some tools and some practices, because I heard a lot of kids and a lot of faculty say a lot of kids are darn glad they're not spending an hour to drive and park to listen to a 1-hour class and then drive and park back home 3-4 days a week.
Mark, can you confirm if you were using Concept Board as a program?
I've just recently looked at Concept Board, and it seems to be very similar to Miro. Miro has a lot of crappy templates, just like Concept Board, and I think you've got to strip it down to make it actually useful. But it appears to be very similar. And there's also online chat functions and online, like a meeting, a face-to-face sort of meeting as well. So I've only begun to experiment with these. I am no expert at all. And I think in a way that's nice, because it puts us in a position to be students as well. If I'm interpreting some of what Andrew was saying, he's actually excited, I think, to be a student again, to say, wow, there's some things that we actually can learn. Not only can we learn from our students, but we can learn about technologies that.
And I think one of the things that's challenging is that they know what the new thing is that's probably better than the previous thing. I'm barely learning Concept Board, and I got someone tell me, oh, I need to look at Slack. So I'm like, oh gosh, that's another thing. So I've decided this summer with my research students, I'm gonna have them tell me, I actually want to do a current research project and have the students who are off-site use it as a chance for them to interrogate the different options out there, because I have no idea really what Slack is, but I want to jump in and see what it does, and recognize that, just like 3D modeling and Lumion and Scape, it's going to change every 2 years. I mean, this week it's Canvas, next week it's going to be picture frame or something else. So
my master's students they selected for their presentation. These are the master's project students. This is the end of their studio sequence. And they decided collectively to use Adobe Portfolio because it's almost invisible. In other words, unlike Adobe Spark, which is something that your grandmother might use, I speak for myself, I tell you, as a scrapbooking technique. I found Adobe Portfolio to be interesting because it allows the students to place their work going back to Theo and some of his very perceptive comments, to place your work not just in a single grid, right, but in a grid which has a temporal extension as well and has hierarchical layers. So in a way, it's almost invisible, and I like that. I don't like things where the structure comes forward beyond the work, if you understand, right? And so I felt that worked pretty well. And at the very end, the students are sending me this evening, because tomorrow's our last day of class. Students are sending their link to their Adobe portfolio, and I'm putting all of that into a Padlet gallery. And then I'm sending that link to the other faculty and to people who are interested. And that way, all the students are listed in Padlet, which is a gallery type program. And you can click and it can go to those individual, they're hot linked to the individual websites, which are Adobe portfolio. And this is something that the students experimented with. And I decided that I couldn't agree to it unless I played with it. And 15, 20 minutes in Adobe portfolio and I'm convinced, right? I mean, these are very simple programs. So it didn't put a lot of weight on the students this semester to learn something new. They felt that this was not an effort. And I also want to mention that I was a little concerned about final presentations because I'm a little obsessed with review work. I hate juries. I'm not a very good jurist. I don't like to wear the powdered blue wig. And I find that the progress review is much more productive. And what Andrew describes is these different rooms and a lot of different alumni coming through. Man, that fits perfectly with my thoughts of a progress review. We decided not to have a final presentation in my studio because the weight on some of these students, the stress is a lot more than you can imagine right now. And I think it's all too easy because I'm in my familiar environment, my white male middle class world here. It's very easy for me to forget that my students are not so fortunate, most of them.
Mark, Kristina asked a question here in the chat. Can you confirm if you can upload a PDF with multiple pages in Mural?
I've only uploaded JPEGs myself, but I think, PDFs are funky because of the algorithm that generates them. They don't translate well. You can open them up. I would probably not try to do that. I'd probably convert them. Adobe Acrobat can convert to JPEG. You can use Photoshop to convert to JPEGs. The advantage to Miro is you can actually compose something, not just linear bands, but you can actually compose boards. And I'll have to check on that, but I think that you want to use JPEG or
you can use the PDFs, and the nice thing about the multi-page PDF is that they align themselves. Hi, I'm Anna Marie Bliss from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and I teach the first year comprehensive design and graduate studios here. So we use both Concept Board and Miro this semester, and we would upload the PDF files, and if it's multiple pages, it'll automatically stick them all together and align them. So the students just have to do a little work rearranging if they don't have them in the right order. But we had students use that for final presentations with no issues. One concern I put in the chat is that Concept Board free version has a 100 object limit. So the more slides or images you put in, you're taking away from that object limit. So you have up to 100. So once you start getting up to your 100 limit, you can't add more markups or comments to the board. So something to be mindful of. So Miro has a more unlimited capacity in that way. So we found that we liked it for that part, but we like the Concept Board markup system better. So it's a balance. It depends on how many students you're using and how many students you want to be engaged. My reviewers had no trouble with it, which was wonderful. And I really liked, like Mark said, having people come, my former students, alumni, those kinds of things come in to help with reviews was wonderful. So it felt more like a charrette. It wasn't so formal. Thanks.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Somebody, Carol Herman, said she has a Miro board to screen share if we want. Okay, that sounds great, Carol.
It's not first year, but it's pretty clear to see. Hang on, I get it open, and it's this one. So you can see it's a series of it's up. Is it up?
Yes, it is.
It's a series of separate PDFs, and he presented both a slideshow and he sent us the link to the project before he began, or he and his teammate began presenting. So it worked pretty well. It wasn't the live edit that Mark was talking about, but you can see it organized pretty nicely, and yes, they were PDFs. Whoops, sorry about that. And you can zoom in it at your leisure.
But the concept board that I saw in the Tuskegee presentation, then people can also draw on this and insert comments. On this one, is that possible?
Oh, I don't know. I didn't try, and I just shut it down.
Yes. I just didn't see. It's okay. I just didn't see the drawing tools there in the corner.
Professor Bliss can probably answer this better than I can because I didn't actually use it but a few times.
We did draw on them, and the nice thing is they have you can use the arrows or the other markup tools. There are several markup tools in there. And the nice thing is I can just, like, if I want a student to look at a precedent, I can grab the image from Google and pop it right in. Miro has built within it, you can actually search within the Miro browser, so you don't have to use multiple browsers either, which is quite nice.
So it's kind of interesting to go in and tag, and you could go in and you can critique student work by leaving little notes behind in these things. I mean, I think there's different ways to operate here that we're just discovering. I mean, for the first time today, I set my cameras up in my wood shop. I say wood shop, I mean my garage, but it's a wood shop. Don't tell my wife, she's at this meeting too.
We're approaching our time, and so I want to just see, is there anyone who hasn't had a chance to comment or add a point before we leave? I want to give an opportunity to anyone who really has a point or comment or an observation that they haven't had a chance to give. Please do that. That's something we would like to receive.
I might have a comment, which is, I believe that not all of the objectives that we had before could be passed to the students now, such as, for example, learn from direct observation, learn from tactile experiences, and so on. Did you ever thought that maybe this could be pushed towards the second year, or you simply find other solutions? I would like to learn with you guys.
Anyone respond to that question, idea?
I'm not sure I quite understood the question about pushing what to second year.
So what I was asking is, those objectives that you cannot teach on first year, could you move them to second year? Is that an option, or you guys think, no, maybe is not the best would be something else? I don't know.
Yeah, that's what we're doing here in Ireland right now with the first year with engineering courses, particularly figuring out which learning outcomes we will have to pick up later on. But we had some trouble with the program I just started. The students didn't have enough foundational knowledge, so we couldn't push that. We just had to delay the whole thing. So I think, it really depends upon which skills have to come in a certain order.
I wanted to reply to that. This is Norma Blizzard from University of Texas, San Antonio. And yeah, a lot of this conversation has been directed at the end of the semester and the presentations and reviews. And I think all of us that are fearful that our fall semester could also be online, I think most people here prefer that the fall semester for first year students to be very tactile, and the digital media is very seductive And in response to Kristina, who just asked, if we have to postpone the tactile projects that we all enjoy, things like building models, casting plaster, all those things through which we teach craftsmanship and care, which we want all of our graduates to go out into the, when they're supervising the projects to be actually built, we would hope that they would care about craftsmanship and have actually struggled through that themselves. And it seems very difficult if we cannot begin with that at the beginning of their design education. And I don't feel it can be easily postponed because of that. After you build your model in SketchUp, you don't want to struggle with a knife and chipboard and glue. And I still want them to struggle with a knife and chipboard and glue.
So I think one of the conversations that Professor Grant and I had back and forth a couple of times over the last few weeks were, is it asking too much to ask the students to do this in this different environment? And one of the questions was on modeling. So as part of this assignment, we normally try to at least introduce the idea of topography to the students. And we ask them to build their first model where they have to figure it out. And these are all done by hand. And in the end, we kind of said, you know what, it's important that they at least start to grasp the concept. It may not be as easy to teach it, but let's do it anyways and see how they react and adjust how we're trying to explain it as we need to in order to make the idea come across. And part of how we approached it was that as opposed to just saying, here's what I want you to do, we would try to actually do everything that we were asking them to do. So every model that we asked them to make, I also made myself. And part of that was in troubleshooting any potential roadblocks they may come against so that we could address them to begin with. But also part of that was being able to say to the students, it is possible. There are no excuses. Here is an example of what we're asking you to do at a level of craft that we know you can accomplish, and holding them kind of responsible for replicating that effort in their own environment. And so it goes to the same thing with like teaching drawing skills when you're not in the studio and can physically show them how that T-square is supposed to work on their desk. You're going to have to, I think, in some ways demonstrate it and then just force them to struggle through it and be prepared to look at different ways that you can help them get over those humps of figuring it out. But I don't think you have to abandon it. It's really understanding that it's just going to be more difficult on the front end to get some of these ideas and approaches across to the students in that kind of digital setup.
I made the recommendation to our department chair that Design 1 be pushed into the spring semester and recombined with Design 2. We have these are 3 credit hour courses, right? And to create a single 6 credit hour studio. And, you know, in spite of my document camera, who's my best friend now, by the way, one of my best friends, Hugh, I call him Hugh, which is very useful for demonstrations, and especially sketching, but it's not the same. And it can't be the same, because what happens when you cast plaster the first time, you actually realize that there's a ritual involved, which is a community ritual. It's collective. It's not individual. It's not really a technique. I'm not interested in teaching technique, to be honest. That sounds rude, but I'm not. I'm interested in students taking on a different way of thinking through the process. And because of that, I'm interested in the ritual. And the ritual is something that you can't do by yourself. You know, I mean, I guess if you're an ordained priest, you can do it yourself, but I think the rest of us can't. And we depend upon the community. So the casting of plaster is not a technique. I'm not interested in that. Neither is cutting chipboard. It is not a technique. It is a way of thinking, and it's done collectively. And you can't do it if you teach it as a technique using something like you. That's my gut reaction. It sounds rude, doesn't it? But it's the way it is.
but I think we're out of time. And I'm sorry to be the timekeeper, because this is, of course, an incredible discussion. And I really appreciate everyone joining in, contributing your ideas, and spurring this discussion. We can talk to ACSA to see if how we can continue some of these ideas, or at least collect some of these chats and these ideas. I don't know if I guess this is recorded, so it should be available for us to review and see how we can continue this. I don't know if Beginning Design Conferences is happening this year. I think it's canceled because of the pandemic.
Steve is here. You can tell us, Beginning Design Conference.
Hi, this is Steve Temple. Yeah, the Beginning Design Conference has been pushed off. I don't know when it's been rescheduled for. I don't know if Andrew Tripp was on here. He was part of the formation of it at A&M, but it's going to happen next year instead of this year. And they're contemplating another round of submittals, and they're also contemplating doing some online submittals. So they're incorporating this process into it rather than the entire thing being in person.
Great. So I think this is time for us to sign off. I appreciate the conveners, Shannon, Kristina, Theo, Margarida, all of you who are out there. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Brad.
Bye.
Really good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Bradford. Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you all very much. Kristina, wonderful
Thank you, Shannon.
emceeing.
Thank you, Brad.
I love it.
Hi, Carmina.
Shannon, it's great to see you.
Really a treat to see all of you. I mean, it's so moving. Thanks for being here.
Sorry.